All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar has been convened by the Critical Zone CZN, or Critical Zone Network, CZN, Early Career Network, in partnership with the Critical Zone Collaborative Network. This is the third in a series that the Critical Zone CZN Early Career Network has planned with the goal of enhancing collaboration and synthesis across CZ observatory and watershed sites. This is the third week of this Cyberseminar Series, Introduction to the Critical Zone Observatories and Watershed Sites. This will in total be a 6-part series and will continue each week at this time until September 28th. My name is Julie Masterman. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for CUAHSI. CUAHSI is the consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, and our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water science at all levels through programs like the Cyberseminar Series. We also have another upcoming Cyberseminar Series that starts tomorrow on perspectives on urban flooding. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to check out our social media and website to sign up for that one as well. But CUAHSI also serves as the national coordinating hub for the Critical Zone Collaborative Network, or CZCN. We're thankful to the members of the CZ network team for their contributions to this series. I would encourage you to visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, or join our community Slack channel to learn more about CUAHSI or get involved. I'll add information on those things in the chat in just a moment. But a few logistical things before we kick off this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel later this evening. Secondly, we ask that you utilize the Q&A functionality to ask questions throughout this series or throughout this webinar. We'll try to get to as many as we can at the end, but feel free to keep them coming as we go through all the talks that we have planned for today. Finally, we expect that all involved with CUAHSI Cyberseminars promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful, and collaborative virtual environment. Thank you for doing your part with that. So once again, thank you for joining us and to the CZN Early Career Network for putting together this fantastic lineup of presentations, and for our presenters for taking the time to join us today. Today's session will be about managed and agricultural sites. And with that, I will pass the mic on to one of our coordinators today. Or first, I'll pass it on to Avna Aurora to give us a little more information about the CZN Early Career Network. Take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Julia. I want to share the slides here. So welcome everyone to week 3 of this CUAHSI Cyberseminar Series. We're very excited to host the seminar that's focused on managed and agricultural sites. I'm super excited to learn about, what is unique about the sites and how do we move towards more synergies and convergent themes. So we really have an international, sites being described today, all the way from US agricultural sites to European sites to India and Chinese sites. And most of the sites have operated, as I said before, in a siloed fashion, thinking about what's unique about our sites. And this team, or this early career cohort team, is thinking about what are the governing science questions that might be similar for across these sites? What are those models and data that can go beyond an individual site? So in the same vein, we are also organizing an AGU workshop to think about how do we develop an international critical zone network of networks for the next generation through shared science, tools, data, and philosophy. That workshop is going to be held prior to the AGU Fall meeting. And we're really thinking about how to enhance an international early career network that's focused on identifying a subset of prioritized grand challenge questions, and how do we integrate and synthesize data across these diverse sites and think together in facilitating coordinated and transdisciplinary investigations of the critical zone. So one good news about this is that we do have some funding for graduate students in early careers to participate in this workshop. So do think about registering for this workshop. So that's the news from my end. I want to pass this on to the other facilitators, Chris and Sylvain. So Chris, please take this away.
Thank you, Bhavna. As Bhavna has said, what makes this seminar unique, this week's seminar unique, is that we're focusing on critical zone observatories in managed sites. So these are sites where the management of the land has a lot to exerts a lot of influence on the functioning of that landscape. We've selected speakers that are PIs of sites all over the world, as you can see on our map. And we also pose to them, and we pose to you, the audience, these three questions to help you think across sites, which is, of course, the aim of this overall series. The questions were: how is land management involved in your site and your data collection? How has land management affected the function of the critical zone at your site? And how transferable are these insights to other sites or to scales? Some of these critical zone observatories are focusing mostly on the soil pedon scale. Some of them are at the small watershed scale, and some of them cross a number of different watersheds. So with the session introduced, I'll turn it over to Sylvain Kuppel, and he will be introducing the different speakers of this session.
Thank you, Chris. So we will start right away with Esteban Jobbagy from the CONICET in Argentina, who is a researcher leading a group at the University of San Luis. Esteban, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvain. Thank you, Chris. And I'm just bringing today some of the few things we have been learning in a very peculiar watershed. Let me show you where we are. This is a very flat region, sedimentary region with semi-arid climate. That's a relatively warm temperate. We have rainfall only coming in summer, monsoonal type of rainfall. And this is a low soil plain, basically dust that was blown away from the Andes into these plains. Over the last century, gradually, we have been changing the grasslands and forests by non-irrigated agriculture. And this is important. This is dryland agriculture, no irrigation at all. Over the last 4 decades, we have been seeing an amazing transformation here. Actually, there were no watersheds in the past here, no streams. What you see over the left is the map of the developing watershed that today has 1,500 square kilometers and has been connecting segments of new rivers like the one you see here in the picture. Over the last 20 years, we went in this particular place from a flat plain with a slight deposit of sediments to next an incision in 2009 that in 2015 became a canyon of 20 by 60 meters, has permanent water flowing. Something interesting is that the sediments on these walls tell us that this was Eolian material throughout the whole Holocene, and before the glaciation, there were signs of rivers doing this in the past. Our main question here is how plants compete with streams for the scarce water of this system, and particularly how agriculture has been changing that. And specifically, we want to explore different mechanisms by which plants and streams compete with each other, and how we want to know how transformations in the vegetation affect these mechanisms or their relative importance. So if we look from the perspective of plants, there's obviously the classic mechanism by which plants consume water in the unsaturated zone, restricting the amount of water that can go to groundwater and feed the streams. But we know that plants can tap groundwater. Typically, they do so in riparian areas, and that's mechanism 2. But in very flat landscapes, we are learning more and more that plants can have a distributed access to the groundwater. And we call this mechanism 3, a distributed access to the saturated zone that helps plants compete with streams. Now let's move to the streams. How can they compete with plants? This dynamic stream network helps us understand that, and we have here 2 mechanisms. First, the incision, number 4, the deepening of incisions that increases the hydraulic gradient towards the and steals water from the saturated zone that may be accessed by plants, but also the reburial of plants with sediments. So I will show you just a few results. The measurements we do here are very simple. We have a network of monitoring wells, and particularly here I'm showing you, you can see in the lower picture, a network of sites or a transect of sites that go away from the incision in pair plots that have agriculture on the upper part and forest in the lower part. When we monitor the wells here, we see this very clear pattern through the last years, which were very dry. There were no high rainfall events, lower than normal precipitation, where you can see that while the groundwater levels, which are around 8 meters deep here, go slowly down in the cropland, they take these big deepenings under the forest when the forest has leaves. These gray bars show the active period of the forest. So every spring and during the summer, the level in the forest goes down and recovers during the winter. These are prosopis trees, like the mesquite in North America, a deciduous species that we have here. In a fractal way, at the diurnal scale, we see the same pattern. During the night, the levels in the forest go up and go down again during the day, whereas in the cropland they are stable. So it's clear for us that the relics of forests are displaying this mechanism 3. They are consuming groundwater in a distributed way throughout the plains. Let's go now to the other side of the story, which are the streams. These are very simple measurements of flow in the different streams. And I just want to show you that when we go to the deepest stream, the incision that's 20 meters deep, is the red line there. You go through time and the base flow is extremely stable. Very likely, this stream has pushed the levels of groundwater down far enough that plants are not reaching them. But you go to the other streams, which are all the other colors, and you see this strong seasonality, which is quite surprising because we have summer rains, but the levels go up in winter. And the explanation for this that we have is that winter is a time when evapotranspiration is at its lowest point. So evapotranspiration rather than precipitation is driving the base flow of this river. At last, I want to point one very interesting case, which is the blue side, where you can see that the base flow goes down and disappears. And this happens when a new stream gets formed close by, and this is a case of stream piracy. Not only plants are competing with streams here, but streams compete with each other in this groundwater-mediated hydrological system. To close, I just want to say that our studies in this system are pointing towards the interplay of the depth of the incisions and the depth of roots, which are much deeper in the case of trees compared to the croplands that are now the matrix of the landscape, controlling the position of the water table. And as they do so, they control how plants access to groundwater and how streams get groundwater. In this dynamic interplay in which ecology and geomorphology play together, shaping hydrology. And we think this applies for many other floodplains with sedimentary materials with a dry climate, which are depicted in the map above. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban, for this great talk. Well, I think we will continue with a talk by Muddu Shekar, professor at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Shekar, if you want to share your screen, and whenever you're ready, it's all yours. I think you're muted. I think we lost Shekar. So maybe we can, for now, move on to the next talk by Lixin. If you, Shekar, you back? All right. Okay, we'll see what happens. And maybe Lixin, if you're ready, you can start your presentation. Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much.
Can you see my screen now yet?
Yes.
Okay.
What is it?
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. So my name is Lixin, I'm from University of Texas, El Paso. I'm the lead PI for the Dwell and Critical Zone team here in the States. So our focus for the project is on carbon because in dryland, both inorganic carbon and organic carbon are quite important. So we are trying to model the carbon fluxes with changing climate and land use. For me, my primary interest is on inorganic carbon because we know with really water deficiency, you don't have mineral dissolution. Instead, you have precipitation of secondary minerals. And we know that hydrogenic carbonate, also known as secondary calcite, is very important inorganic carbon reservoir. It sequesters carbon dioxide at a very large scale. So we have a really large team with 17 people from 4 institutions and 1 organization. We also have amazing collaborators and students working on the project. So today we'll be talking about managed and agricultural sites. Just so you know, for the critical zone project, we actually have both natural and agricultural sites because land use is one of the gradient we're looking at. We're also looking at temperature gradient. That's why we have sites in Idaho, which represent the cold and dry system. And then we have southern New Mexico and Western Texas represent the hot and dry ecosystem. Here I'm showing you a picture on the left. It's a pig orchard I have worked on for the last 5 years. This is right after the flood irrigation. We use the Rio Grande water for irrigation, and the water is pretty salty, somewhere between 700 to 1,000 part per million. So you can imagine that the water is really salty. Therefore, the soils are really salty, and that's a big problem for our ecosystem in the managed land. With water, the critical zone become more active hydrologically, biologically, and chemically. And also it promotes the reaction. With water, we also have loading of bicarbonate and calcium. When you start to evaporate, the system becomes super saturated with respect to calcite. Therefore, secondary calcite will precipitate. At the same time, carbon dioxide will be released into atmosphere. This reaction has been studied intensively in the natural system, but in agriculture field, nobody had looked at them before. So for this project, part of the my interest is on this abiotic carbon dioxide. So we're trying to answer 3 questions. 1, we want to quantify this flux. Secondly, we want to partition biotic versus abiotic carbon dioxide fluxes, because we know in the soils, not only this chemical reaction contribute to carbon dioxide, we call abiotic carbon dioxide, but soil respiration also consume oxygen and produce CO2 as well. So we need to really identify which reaction is more important by how much. The last one is really to investigate what are the primary controls on temporal evolution and also the magnitude of this abiotic carbon dioxide efflux. So to answer the first question, we really employed different sensors at different scales. For example, on the ground, we're using EOSense FD sensors that allow us to capture this efflux from the soils at really high resolution. We also use eddy currents tower, picture over here on the right. For this pig orchard, we actually have 2 equal eddy currents tower systems above the canopy and below the canopy, so we can quantify the exchange between the ecosystem with atmosphere for carbon and water. We're also exploring a lot of different sensors. For example, the tunable diode laser absorption spectrometry and hyperspectral imaging system. We couple these airborne sensors with drones or road overs so that we can capture carbon dioxide fluxes at very high spatial scales. This is just the hyperspectral imaging system being tested in the field using controlled conditions. To answer the second question, we have a couple tools. The first one is using carbon dioxide and oxygen sensors, because we know depending if you have the abiotic reaction on the top or the soil respiration on the bottom reaction, different amount of oxygen will be utilized. By coupling or decoupling of oxygen and carbon dioxide, we will be able to determine which reaction is more important in contributing carbon dioxide to atmosphere. The second tool is traditional carbon isotopes. If you combine carbon dioxide concentrations with isotopes and plot them in these conventional heating plots, you not only identify different end members, but you also can determine the relative importance of different end members. You can do so using physical gas samples collected from the field, or you can use something like this, which is called carbon dioxide isotope analyzer, where it's a chamber system. You can monitor carbon dioxide concentration and therefore fluxes and the isotope at the same time. So you can make heating plots at 5 minutes interval. The third one, to investigate the major controls for our system, the primary control is soil texture, because here the soils are developed on fluvial sediments, and these are really different depending on the energy when these sediments are deposited. It could be coarser sandy material, or it could be finer clay material, and that really control how fast water infiltrate, therefore how much the salt can be leached out, and therefore how fast the salt can build up and the petrogenic carbonate can build up. So we're using a lot of the geophysical tools to help us with that. So when it comes down to how these understanding in our system can be transferred to other systems, I really think the major controlling factors will play important roles. For example, I mentioned soil texture because that controls the water dynamics, but also climate conditions as well. Depending on the partitioning of evaporation and transpiration, you might have different amount of leaching, therefore different amount of salt buildup and gas movement. But also what kind of irrigation you have. We are using flood irrigation. The water is pretty salty, and we irrigate from April to October so many times using a lot of water. And not only that, load a lot of salt to the system, but also if your water is dilute, you might actually reverse the reaction. Instead of precipitating calcite, you might actually dissolving calcite away. So that's the hypothesis we're trying to test in the Kimberley site in Idaho. So globally, we know the salt buildup is extremely crazy in both natural and irrigated system. So we know calcite is less soluble than salt. So if you already have high salinity, that means all these sites you might have petrogenic carbonate accumulation already. So it'll be interesting to test these hypotheses in other sites. So with that, I like invited you to visit our website, drylandcz.org. We have student and postdoc opportunities. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lixin. And my apologies for not introducing you at the beginning because of the change in schedule. So, but you did a great job at introducing the group at the University of Texas El Paso. Okay, so without further ado, we will move on to if Shekar is not yet ready, or if you're okay, we can start with the presentation. Professor Shekar. Okay, so while we try to sort out this connection, well, we'll move on to Professor Kumar at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for this opportunity to give a very, very brief overview of the critical zone science in intensively managed landscapes. I speak on behalf of our team. We have a pretty large team, and we have been at it for a few years now. This project evolved from a previous or an ongoing effort on intensively managed landscapes critical zone observatory, and then we have a continuation project here called CINet, Critical Interface Network. So on the left hand side, you see where we are located, the IML. In the first phase, we have these 3 sites in Illinois and Iowa, and partnership with a site in Minnesota. But all 3 of these sites are within the upper Mississippi River boundaries. And during this next phase, the CINet project, we have expanded to include several other sites. The one which you see in the white are the sites we are going to be folding into for a cross-site characterization. What you see in the yellow are the partners that are part of this effort. The IML-CZO will end in a couple of months, and we will continue with the CINet effort. And the goal is to look at agricultural questions in the US Midwest, particularly the glaciated Midwest. The picture you see is essentially satellite image between October and August. August is when we have full leaf on, and October is after harvest, and with some fall related leaves falling off the trees. And so the kind of thing that we are doing is pretty broadly, we hope will be pretty broadly applicable to the larger Midwest section of the United States, and also stretching beyond those boundaries. So this is a traditional characterization of what critical zone science is, basically looking at everything from the top of the canopy down to the groundwater, and looking at from molecular scale to the watershed scale, with a big difference. You've seen these pictures before. In our landscape, essentially there is significant modification of these landscapes, and that's what we are trying to characterize. So basically these tillage systems mix the near surface layer very quickly for growth. There is tile drain implemented across the landscapes to drain the water, to create an unsaturated zone for plant growth, as well as getting these machines up into the landscape. And as you can see, these tile drains carry a lot of water, and these are approximately at 30-meter distance. So you can get quite a bit of water flowing through these tile drains, thereby impacting the hydrology and associated critical zone processes. In order to make these landscape functional, there were these streams that were artificially dug out during the European settlement. So the bottom left, where you saw the tile drains, essentially also you see these artificial channels, and these artificial channels were built to basically get the water out of the tile drain and drain them away and drain these landscapes. So in the picture you see on the dark blue lines are basically what was noted as streams from about 200 years ago. And what you see in the blue lines are modern days from LiDAR. And you can see a lot of straight channels in there that were artificially built. And on top of it, we put a lot of fertilizers on these landscapes, so the chemistry is substantially altered. So our goal is basically to understand how all this affects critical zone processes. In the CINet project, I said we are going to look at several sites, and that's what this is about. We are going to capture gradients associated with geomorphology and hydrology, as well as with respect to tile drains, with respect to glacial history and landscape formation. So this is an opportunity for us to do a lot of cross-site comparison as well. So basic questions and hypotheses. In our case, what you're looking at is trying to understand the interdependencies between the carbon, the soil, the nutrients, water, and ecological systems. And this interdependence is essentially all affected by land use and climate change, farming and tillage, channel extension and straightening, tile drains, fertilizer applications, and loss of wetlands and native vegetation. And these interdependencies are at multiple timescales. So essentially these gears represent timescales. So smaller gears are faster timescale. So water is your fastest process here, and soil formation is the slowest process here. And so we're trying to understand how these interdependencies happen over the short to the long timescale processes. So for observations, we basically have a whole suite of things that we have done over the last 8 years through the IML-CZO effort, from deploying fiber optic cables in to 100-meter depths to basically flying planes and putting sensors in the belly of the aircraft. The flux tower, a lot of rainfall experiments and observations in the stream channels. So we have LiDAR and hyperspectral data and flux tower observations in their soil samples, all kinds of stuff that we have collected over time. And so in the CINet project, we put something called a river lab. We are sucking water out of this river, putting into a lab for ion chromatographic analysis and physical characterization. So we're looking at something like 16 different ions at about half-hour temporal interval. This is Jenny Truman, who's leading this effort. We are looking at how plants, roots affect soil processes. So we just put this system in place to look at water chemistry and gaseous exchanges and so forth. There will be about 4 of these deployed. So this is in restored prairie, and we're going to put in agriculture sites and go from there. We have basically look at floodplain chlorine and to look at how these things which move from the upper part of the landscape get deposited in floodplains, and to understand the long-term legacy of agriculture. And before that, our log data is available through our own data portal. Just do a data.imlczo.org and you should be able to find this. It's also posted in the CUAHSI website, and we continue to maintain this and build upon this for our new project, CINet. So this has been a great sandbox for collaboration, for education, lots of work in the field and in the laboratory, site visits and site characterizations and so forth. So I think there's been tremendous excitement, and there is a richness of explorations that we would welcome more people to engage and work with us or take advantage of all the things that we have been able to do. So with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. For this great talk. We will try to keep time and move forward. And the next talk is by Muddu Shekar from the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Shekar, you're on.
Thank you so much. Here is my talk. This is on the, I hope I'm audible. This is a small catchment which we are looking in the southern part of India on the, we call it Berambadi catchment. It is connected to a network of multi-scale tropical catchments. And as you can see in the southern part of India. So this particular site is coming from a tributary of Kaveri, which is in the southern part of India. And there are 2 twin sites. One is a forested, another is agriculture site, which are close by. The forest is a national park. That's how we chose. And the site is close to the Indian Deccan Plateau, where you can see an orography causing the precipitation or an order of magnitude. And you can see that the agriculture catchment would look like this, with small agriculture plots of something like about 1 hectare size, and typical farming sizes and various types of multi-crop types. In roughly in about a square kilometer, you will have probably 40-50 types of crop types. And what is interesting is the bigger catchment where we are looking at, where we are understanding this, as in the upper part, which is a more humid catchment, where the rainfall is about 3,000 plus mm, and where you have rice and tea and agroforestry. You have the deciduate forest, which is essentially a tiger reserve in between. And then you have canal irrigation, which has happened post Green Revolution. And then you have a piece of land which is essentially driven by groundwater irrigation. So we're looking at understanding these suite of independent pieces in this. I'm going to present to you the Berambadi catchment. So there are several processes here, highly disturbed, a lot of agriculture water use in the last several years. And the interesting part is that in order to look at this, we're looking at the various domains of science aspects like hydrology, agronomy, geochemistry, geophysics, soil science, and so on, being a relatively larger size catchment because to study remote sensing, we kept this order of size. And one of the key questions which we have looking at this is how to decipher the impacts of agriculture and climate variability and water and soil resources. So being in semi-arid, the water is a predominantly an important component here. And typical variability of rainfall is of the order of about annual scale, about coefficient of variation of 25%. And a suite of observational methods have been put here. The monitoring related to, we have about 250 monitoring wells to understand this catchment. Then we have the soils, we have the all other hydrological and other variables. So what is interesting part of this site is that what you can see here is the Baramwadi catchment, which is in the upper part of the sub-basin, and the lower part in the valley, you have a river which used to go in the past. So this part has been has a better soils being in the lowland, and it's been exploited by groundwater. So you can see that the color index of yellow and red is the groundwater which is overexploited there, and the catchment is little on the upland. So you can see that topographically the water supposed to be moving down to the valley over here. And then over time, the groundwater levels started further going down. As you can see, these are the water levels in the Baramwadi catchment, which is in the upland, and you can see the lower land where the groundwater table is much further. So the interesting part is that because of the too much of groundwater pumping downstream, the water is going. But then we have the hard rocks, gneissic rocks. Interest is to understand how is the upland and downland connections. So typically how within the watershed, how this is getting driven in different years is shown over here. So one of the important aspects here is that from a hydrological point of view, the groundwater gradient is over here, and the groundwater levels towards the streams are often deeper than the upland. So that means around the stream, my groundwater levels are deeper because the humans have been using more water use in the lowland. Typical water tables are about 80 plus 100 meters due to intensive use. So depleting water resources, disconnections with groundwater and stream. In some places, the stream is not active anymore. So the questions are, how is the groundwater connectivity and a spatial scale and dramatic changes of rainfall variations across years brings the water levels very fast coming up, and there's a big connection between the groundwater and the recharge pathways. So there are, as you can see, the dynamics of the groundwater table are quite high. You can see that suddenly due to an extreme event, you can recover back all the 10 years of water table. So the interesting point is how are these connected on the laterally due to these is the question. And of course, the humans have been making a huge impact on this from an agronomic point of view. And typically the irrigated ecosystem uses much more nitrates. So the nitrates have been evolving due to the use of it from a water quality point of view. So what you see over here is that the nitrate concentrations are highly sensitive to the groundwater elevation gradient. So when you have high gradients due to the fluxes, you don't see any more nitrates, irrespective of how you apply. It's about flushing of the water. When the gradients are smaller, they are like 1D cycling, where depending upon the loading, the nitrate concentrations are. So what it indicates is that the groundwater is also sensitive in terms of the yields of the water, which are sensitive to the cropping choices, etc. As you go deeper, the yield is, when the groundwater level goes down, the yield becomes smaller. And in short, the extreme nitrate concentrations are essentially related to deeper groundwater, very low gradients, very low discharge in the wells, are all cause pockets of extreme nitrate concentration of the order of 300, 400 milligrams per liter. So studying it from a methodological point of view, we're looking at soil moisture from various variables to reconstruct the understanding so that we can build scenarios with the stakeholders for adaptation of water use, efficient water use, then also use groundwater as an adaptation measure to buffer against droughts, evapotranspiration analyzed from various methods, energy balance, and so on. Then looking at for developing the models, development of properties on soil hydraulic properties from remote sensing, understanding crops because we have diversity of crops. So how to estimate the identify the crops, mapping the groundwater irrigation, and also making soil digital soil mapping. So these are some of the facets and other variables. So in short, the various opportunities we have here are how does the role and functioning of groundwater and surface water at multiple scales in intensely irrigated system, how to adapt agro ecosystems to ensure sustainability and resilience in the changing environment, what else we can monitor further and strengthen the system, and development of decision support tools for stakeholders, and et cetera, et cetera. Thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you, Shekar. All right, so time is running, so we will quickly move on to Laurie Boithias, who is a researcher at the Géosciences Environnement Toulouse. And well, Laurie, if you're ready, it's your own.
Thank you. So as you already know from the presentation of Shekar, the multi-scale tropical catchments critical zone observatory, also known as Entropics, is a network of 6 monitored catchments in the intertropical belt. And I will give you an overview of the research performed on the Waipano catchment in Laos over 20 years, including the impact of land use change on hydrology and sediment exportation. So there are very few catchments monitored in the tropics. So why monitoring a catchment in Laos? Northern Laos is a region of mountains located in the humid tropics, and slopes are steep, and combined to heavy rains, it makes the area very prone to high surface runoff and to high soil erosion. Besides, the region is experiencing rapid land use changes with urbanization, dam construction, and conversion from traditional slash and burn agricultural systems with long fallow periods to commercial teak tree plantations. So the initial goal of Entropics in Laos was to assess the long-term impact of this land use conversion on the catchment hydrological response and on sediment yield, of course. Of course, other scientific questions have been connected to this general goal, such as the dissemination of pathogenic bacteria, of weed seeds, of carbon, and including modeling approaches. The Waipano catchment is 0.6 square kilometers. It's located in northern Laos, 10 kilometers south of Luang City, a UNESCO heritage. And it's part of the Mekong River Basin. So about 71% of the rainfall falls during the monsoon, which lasts from June to October. What we measure is climate, so rainfall, temperature, wind speed, relative humidity, and solar radiation. Land use on the catchment scale, soil surface features, surface runoff, and soil erosion at a 1 square meter plot scale, and water level, suspended sediment concentration, bed load at catchment outlet. And we use a concrete sealing pool with an automatic water sampler. So all these data are available open access on the Entropics website. So as results, I will present the outcomes of the long-term monitoring. Here on the left side, we show the annual land use from 2001 to 2019. And as you can see, annual crops, which are shown as pink, are gradually replaced by the teak tree plantation, shown as light green. And teak tree plantations are now 34% of the catchment area. On the right side, we show the water level, the suspended sediment concentration, and the bed load from 2001 to 2019. In general, we observe more frequent extreme events of rainfall with higher rainfall intensities per day since 2014. At the micropod scale, we show that soil surface feature, especially the crusting rate, depend on the land use. In turn, crusting rate controls soil surface runoff and soil detachment. And teak trees plantations and bare soils, so including village soils, here highlighted with the red box, ranked among the highest erosion-prone soil surfaces. Now we present some results that are based on the long-term monitoring, sometimes adding other variables. Here on the left side, we show that the increase of the tick tree area decreased the soil infiltration rate, increased the surface runoff, and increased the sediment yield, suggesting that the conversion from traditional crops to tick tree plantation induced massive soil erosion. On the right side, we show that the increase in surface runoff and thus soil detachment increases the occupation of E. coli during flood events, with 90% of the E. coli being exported, while surface runoff is 40% of the total flow during flood events. The picture below summarizes the issues faced by the inhabitants of the village located downstream the Waipano catchment. Now here you can see that the village was completely flooded in July 2016 by very turbid water, which was also probably very concentrated in fecal bacteria. And in fact, we show that such extreme events were triggering diarrhea outbreaks in these rural areas. We also performed several modeling studies, and here I show one example on the plot scale and one example on the catchment scale. On the plot scale, we predicted soil detachment based on the effective soil detachability, rainfall yield, kinetic energy, runoff coefficient, and width cover and residue cover. On the catchment scale, we applied the well-known hydrological SWAT model to simulate here, for example, discharge. The other variables that we monitor in the Waipano catchment are weed seeds. So here on the left side, you have a figure that relates the seed bank to the density of seeds in sediment. We also measure set turbidity, geochemistry with major anions and cations, alkalinity, electrical conductivity, groundwater, and landslides. So these data are not open access yet, but one day they will be. So as you can see, there is room for collaborations if you are interested in this 20-year dataset. Future research topics could be to assess the role of headwater catchments in large tropical river basin hydrology, to assess the respective impacts of both climate and land use change on catchment hydrology, to start the monitoring of new variables or to test new modeling approaches, etc. So please have a look to the WEMTOPICS website for more details about the catchment, about the network of experimental catchment, and to access the data. And you can also check our Twitter for the news and contact us for any questions. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Laurie, for this very compact talk and super interesting. I think we will quickly move on to the last talk by Xinhua Peng's team at the Chinese Academy of Soil Science, who couldn't be with us today due to the time lag that made it very, very late there. So his team recorded a video for the presentation that we will play just now.
Okay, good evening, everyone. But I know it's probably not evening now for where you are. I am Yaji, a member of the hydrological group in the Red Soil Critical Zone project. I'm very glad to give this talk. My talk today aims to give a brief introduction about the Red Soil Critical Zone. This is a world satellite map with the locations of current critical zone observatories. We can see clearly that the Red Soil Critical Zone Observatory is among one of them. As for red soils, they are characterized by large area. The red soil in China occupies an area of 2.18 square kilometers, accounting for 23% of China's land. Red soils are typically highly weathered, vulnerable, and degraded. They are infertile, acidic, and clay. Despite the characteristics described above, red soils play an important role in production. It is a rice production base as well as the tropical and subtropical fruit production base. With 23% land supporting 40% population in China, the red soil region is of great importance in agricultural production in China. However, this region now faces intensive anthropogenic perturbation. For example, as shown in the right bottom of this slide, this region faces the dilemma of high nitrogen fertilizer input and low nitrogen use efficiency. These effects, as well as other processes, will influence largely how the critical zone functions. As for a typical Earth critical zone, many processes inside it determines ecosystem services across gears. On one hand, there are a large number of processes listed in this slide, including many fields like soil physics, genesis, and so on. On the other hand, the critical zone provides several study skills for us to investigate these processes. All the processes drive the evolution of ecosystems, facilitate ecosystem services, and they are subject to disturbance by human activities. Based on the discussion above, we have posted the following questions for the Red Soil Critical Zone Observatory. First, we would like to know how do weathering, soil development, and key elements cycling respond to natural and anthropogenic perturbation. Second, from the perspective of hydrology, we would like to know what hydrological processes drive movement in multi-skiers. Third, how do plant, soil, and water interact at the interfaces in critical zone and improve soil productivity and water use efficiency? And the last, we are seeking for the solution about how to integrate and model ecosystem processes at regional scale. The following are some details about the red soil critical zone. We base our main research in the Sunjia watershed. This catchment is 4.1 kilometers from the red soil station. The Sunjia watershed is a typical agricultural mixed watershed in the red soil region, with its complex mixture of paddy fields and upland, and its typical crop growing pattern. This study area has very complex hydrological processes. There is combination of upland ecosystem and paddy field ecosystem, as shown at the right and left corner of this slide. Besides, rainfall and irrigation water are both the main water sources of the catchment. There is also active interactions between subsurface water and groundwater. All the factors above make the hydrological mechanisms in this catchment difficult to figure out. In order to monitor processes, especially hydrological and soil physics processes in the red soil critical zone observatory, we have set up many monitoring devices. For the catchment scale, the weather station, water table data log at the inlet and outlet are all installed. Besides, the irrigation water is also monitored. As for the slope scale, we set up several TDR to monitor soil moisture and erosion plots to monitor soil erosion. As for the subcatchment scale, the water table at the inlet and outlet was also monitored. These monitoring instruments mentioned provides us with sufficient data as for answering the scientific questions mentioned above. That's all for my talk today. Due to the time lag, this is only a screen record. I'm very sorry for all the inconvenience brought. If you have any question, please feel free to email me for more details.
Thank you, Julia and the presenters for this last talk. Before some general questions and closing remarks, I will just mention that all the sites that you've been hearing about today, I think Chris will put up the map that we had, and I will also share in the chat just now a link to a KMZ file, which you can open in Google Earth so that you can look at the sites and then look around the general settings in case you're interested in exploring where they are and get the first idea in space. Chris, did you want to share maybe some general comments and related questions on all the great talks we've been hearing?
Yes. So in addition to thanking our speakers, I did have a couple questions about how transferable insights are across sites and across scales, and I think they were addressed to some extent in the talks. One question that came up that I think would be common to all these sites is that if you've got a managed site, that site will be different than a corresponding natural site. So I'm just wondering how difficult has it been for our panelists to find a suitable natural site to compare the managed site to? If that's been difficult, if it's been fairly straightforward, and how they've gone about doing that, or if they don't find it particularly important to do so. I'd be fascinated with their thoughts on that.
So I can talk about what we do at IML. It's very, very difficult to get a reference site in there. So we have used restored prairie, which is not ideal. And we have done some coring at cemetery sites, which have basically been undisturbed for a long time. It's hard to get permission for those things, but that's our best bet in there. We can get some stuff from riparian corridors, but they are not so representative of the upland sites. So that's a challenge.
That's our experience here in El Paso as well. Because I didn't highlight the map, but most of the agriculture sites are along the Rio Grande Valley, because you can imagine that we highly depend on the water availability. So to make the irrigation easier, all the agriculture sites have to be along the Rio Valley. So there's almost no natural sites per se. When we say natural, that means, with limited human impacts. So that's why for our natural sites, for the dryland critical zone, we actually used LTER site, also known as Jornada Long-Term Ecological Research Site, but they're not quite equivalent because the age, for example, is very different. Those are the Piedmont site, so they are much older, but the Rio Grande Valley, we're looking at just several thousand years of sediments and soil development. So it's been difficult.
I would like to comment on this, and I would be very cautious when looking for a reference. I just bring the example of what happens in our site. We have 12% of forest left, which seems great because you have this reference there. But the fact that the rest of the matrix is agriculture means that the water tables went up. And these forests are working in a totally different mode than the mode they had in the past with much deeper water levels. So even if you think you're getting a reference there, when you go to the situation of groundwater connecting stands and connecting the landscape below ground, then you have new situations everywhere. And we see this affecting the growth and the NDVI of these forest relics, which are growing a lot more now. So maybe there's no reference.
I can say something from our site. I shown you the twin sites. One is an agriculture site. Very close by, we have a national park, which is with tigers and elephants and so on. They are not very far, maybe about few tens of kilometers. The interesting part is it's a forested site. The forests heavily use groundwater. The groundwater levels fall down. The humans are also pumping, so they are very similar in characteristics. These also groundwater levels go down. Nutrient cycling is humans are pumping it, and the trees are also pumping. So there's a similarity, except that the humans behave differently from the forest. So we can compare these two quite well because they are in the same lithology, same climatic system, and so on.
And just to finish, maybe just in our case, we didn't really compare with a pristine situation, but we have this record of land use changes over 20 years. So we can compare the situation now to the situation 20 years ago.
So you're using time instead of a different site for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, very interesting. So we are out of time. I'd love to continue this conversation for hours and hours, but we are out of time. Sylvain, do you have any parting thoughts?
Well, I guess we had a lot of very different settings today, a lot of information. That was great. Thank you to all the presenters today for responding to the invitation. I guess a general question will be, well, in the coming future, how that will change with either direct or indirect environmental change, being by anthropogenic pressure or anthropogenically driven climate change. But that's a very long question just to answer just now. So I think we will just end today and just.
I have a quick comment, Sylvain.
Yes.
Yeah. So please, thank you again to all the panelists, and please join us next week. We are going to focus on, more disturbance, thinking about droughts and wildfire for next week, if that's of interest. And I also forgot to thank CUAHSI for the support for the AGU workshop registration for early careers. Again, if that's something of interest, please do register. So yeah, thank you. Sylvain, anything else, or we close the session?
No, I think we're good for today. I mean, we could speak for hours, but for the sake of I don't know, clarity, we'll just stop now. So thank you all again, and all the attendees as well for joining in. And as Bhavna said, we hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.